Well, meanwhile, Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a vote that could see his government dissolve. Key coalition partners are threatening to bring down his government. The element that could see his demise is the ultra-Orthodox community, which has been calling for a law to be passed to officially and permanently exempt them from military service. A divisive issue that has always split Israel and is now ever more coming to the fore with the ongoing war. To get more insight on it all, we can speak to Middle East Director at the International Communities Organization and a former hostage negotiator between Israel and Hamas, columnist as well for Israeli newspaper, The Times of Israel, and the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds. Mr. Gershon Baskin, thanks so much for joining us here in the France 24 studio. Can we start by maybe the politics in Israel? Tell us a bit more about this vote that's expected today in the Knesset.
Well, the vote is really urgent now because of the war in Gaza. The Israeli army is actually in need of more than 10,000 soldiers because of the large number of soldiers who have been killed, because of the large number of Israeli civilians who are serving reserve duty for hundreds of days. The ultra-Orthodox community has been exempt from military service for all the past years, and now there's a real need. So there is no law that really exempts them from military service. The army is sending out draft notices to them, and they're not showing up. So the issue is whether or not there are going to be sanctions imposed on these young men. There are about 60,000 eligible young Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews who could be in the army who don't show up for military service. And now the debate is whether or not these sanctions should be imposed on them. If my children were not drafted, they would go to prison. And the ultra-Orthodox who get the draft notices and don't show up, they're simply ignored. So this is a change because of the need for soldiers. And of course, the ultra-Orthodox community and their leaders are against making a law that does not continue the exemption of military service.
Could this issue actually bring down Netanyahu's government?
It is probably the only issue that could bring down the government. Now, it's kind of short-sighted on the part of the ultra-Orthodox political leaders because they won't get a better deal anywhere else than they have with Netanyahu. But on the other hand, political decisions are not always coherent, logical. They're sometimes emotional, and there's an emotional response to the failure of Netanyahu to make good on his promise that he would pass a law that would exempt them. Netanyahu's not able to pass that law.
And then the impact, if, and this is all hypothetical for the moment, but if his government falls, the impact then on the war in Gaza?
There wouldn't be an impact. There would be a temporary government which would have all the powers of a regular government until the election date. He might be limited on some of the things that he could do, but still, the question of when this war ends or if it continues is in the hands of Netanyahu. We all know that there was a deal on the table that would end the war. Hamas is demanding that the end of the war be included in any kind of deal that would release the Israeli hostages, the 55 remaining Israeli hostages, amongst who about 20 or 21 are believed to be alive. The overwhelming majority of the Israeli public wants this deal to be done, want the war to end, and want the hostages to come home. And Netanyahu is waging this war as a war to save his coalition. Because if he were to agree to end the war, his coalition would also break up. The right-wing members of his coalition, his Minister of Finance and his Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, would bolt the government, and the government would fall also over this issue.
But how long is he planning to continue this for?
Forever. There are people in his cabinet, the new person that he has appointed to head the Israeli internal security, the Shin Bet, has said that this is a war that will last forever. So there are people that believe that we have to fight this war forever. When we all know that there is no strategic advantage to fighting this war should have ended way long ago. We're in the 19th month of the war. It should have ended after a month, after 2 months. So much killing and destruction has been done. So many Israeli soldiers have been killed. So many hostages have been killed. And the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a humanitarian disaster, which Israel is directly responsible for. Of course, Hamas bears the responsibility for attacking Israel on October 7th, 2023, and they committed an act of national suicide for the Palestinian people on that day. But the destruction that's been done and continues to be done has no strategic value to Israel and has to be stopped.
Indeed, and as you say, they're backing up what you said. I've read that you say, what Benjamin Netanyahu asks for, the complete annihilation of Hamas. is simply, an impossible
It
thing
cannot
to
be done militarily. The annihilation of Hamas can only be done politically by the Palestinian people themselves, who would choose to have leaders who don't want to commit national security. Palestinian people need to, I hope, will come to the conclusion that they have no viable armed struggle against Israel. They have to deal with the existence of Israel. 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs live between the river and the sea. And they have to recognize the right of both sides to be there and come to the conclusion that the French president has come to, that the time for the two-state solution is now. The time for recognition of Palestine is now. This has to be done by the entire international community. At the same time, anyone who talks about a two-state solution should also recognize Israel if they don't. And this is what the French President Macron is trying to push through with a big conference that's happening on Friday here in Paris of hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians who are coming to support the two-state solution. And then, of course, on the 17th of June in New York, the Franco-Saudi summit in the framework of the alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution will take place in New York, hopefully with the whole world coming together and saying this war has to end and we have to move toward peace.
But a major stumbling block is the position of the United States. Only this morning we're hearing from them that this idea of a two-state solution is no longer where they're headed. Well,
I would remind President Trump that when he presented his deal of the century back in his first term, he essentially presented what was a two-state solution. The Palestinian state in his plan wasn't much of a state, and they didn't have control of their borders. But nonetheless, the principle is there. And we all know that Trump believes that this war in Gaza needs to end. That's the first thing that has to happen. The war has to end before we can even talk about a political settlement. But Trump will come to the conclusion as well that there is no alternative to a two-state solution. If he supports Israel's right to defend itself and right to exist, he has to support the Palestinian people's right to exist, to defend themselves, to create a state of their own, because Israel will never have security if the Palestinians don't have freedom, independence, and dignity, and security as well. The Palestinians will never have that freedom, liberation, dignity, security if Israel doesn't have security. That's the deal here.
But we have heard Trump repeatedly push on with his idea of moving nearly Palestinians out of Gaza.
No, this is not reality. This was what the Jordanian king had said in days after he met with President Trump, that he understood that Trump was putting down a challenge to the Arab world to come up with an alternative. The United States is not talking seriously about moving 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza and building a Riviera in the Gaza. This is not real.
But when you look at, or what you hear from coming out of Israel and Netanyahu's plans, it looks like he is trying to annex further parts of Gaza.
Well, I don't think the Israelis want to annex Gaza. I think that they want to move the Palestinians out and to resettle Gaza without the burden of annexation, but this is fantasy. This is not real. This cannot be done. Not only can it be done politically, it's also illegal in international law. It's a war crime.
Well, let's look at that. I mean, we've mentioned there the French president holding this forum, trying to push towards a two-state solution and acceptance of that. But it's coming very late. We're nearly 20 months into this war, and overall, the international reaction has been, well, mute.
Yeah, I would say it's very late because it's 57 years after the Six Days War in 1967 when it should have been done then. We've been talking about a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine since 1947 when the United Nations partitioned the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. So it's way too long, and it's certainly the time now for France to recognize the state of Palestine. I will comment that it won't change reality on the ground, but the big question is, how do we get Israel to recognize the Palestinian people's right? When there are 192 or 193 member states of the United Nations who recognize the state of Palestine and also recognize the state of Israel, Israel will be forced into a corner, pushed into a corner, and will have to recognize Palestine. The main challenge for the Palestinians is to understand that the Israeli people are not their enemy. The Israeli people are the solution. If they can convince the Israeli people that their existence as a state will not endanger their security, they will get much more support from the Israeli public to move in that direction. That's what needs to happen. It's wonderful if France, if the UK, if all the other OECD states recognize Palestine. That's not going to change the life of Palestinians, but nonetheless, the duplicity of talking about a two-state solution while only recognizing one has to come to an end.
As we wait, though, for that to be put in place, I mean, what needs to happen in the more immediate term? We're seeing the UK put sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers for what they're doing in the West Bank, not just Gaza, but what else can the international government do?
I think that's a move in the right direction, but it's not only 2 ministers in the Israeli government that need to be sanctioned. The whole settlement movement needs to be sanctioned. There needs to be put limitations on. I'll give you an example. If Israelis have visa-free access to the European Union, settlers are not living in the state of Israel. They're living in the occupied territory. Why do they enjoy visa-free access to the European Union? Shouldn't they have to fill out an internet form that designates where they live? And if they live in a settlement in the occupied territories, they shouldn't be allowed into France without some special designation and special visa. That's a simple thing that the European Union could do. If you consider settlements illegal, then why do you just label a product as being made in the Israeli settlements? Why are they allowed access to the European markets? If it's illegal, it's contraband. It shouldn't be entering the European markets whatsoever. So I think that there are more things that can be done. And politically, the government of Israel needs to be told by the international community that the time to end this conflict is now. This war in Gaza has been so traumatic for both people, so horrific in the kinds of things that have been done, the moral red lines that have been crossed by both sides, who've allowed themselves to do everything in this war has to be ended. This has to be the last Israeli-Palestinian war.
Meanwhile, you have had direct experience negotiating between Hamas and Israel. I mean, where do you see things going from here?
Okay, President Abbas, the old man Palestinian president of the Palestinian Authority, who's 90 years old and in the 20th year of a 4-year term, certainly lacks legitimacy within Palestine. But nonetheless, at the request of President Macron, he sent a letter yesterday detailing the Palestinian position. And it was very clear in President Abbas's letter to President Macron that the Palestinians should convene elections within a year. And at that time, political parties which do not support the line of the PLO, which is the two-state solution, making peace with Israel, would not be allowed to run. So Hamas as a political movement would not be able to participate in those elections unless Hamas changes itself. If Hamas were to accept the existence of Israel, accept the PLO position of negotiations to the two-state solution, Hamas would no longer be Hamas. I think it's quite clear that the people in Gaza don't want Hamas anymore. A very small number of people in Gaza still support Hamas. The support for Hamas in the West Bank is waning. Hamas probably has more support amongst the Palestinian diaspora or so-called pro-Palestinian activists in the West than they actually do in Palestine. And that needs to be considered. When people call out the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," this is la-la land. This is not reality. Palestinians living in Palestine understand that they can't throw 7 million Israeli Jews into the sea. So I would suggest we start calling on from the river to the sea on two states we agree. That's a slogan that portends a much better future for the people of Israel and the people of Palestine.
And very finally, we've spoken about what the international governments and authorities could do, but why do you think they've taken so long to react at all? We've seen the red lines, as you said,
I think that Israel has played the anti-Semitism card, and that scares Europe in particular with the history of the Holocaust. It has to be very clear, anti-Semitism is illegitimate at all times, in all places. Criticism of Israel is legitimate. Now, there are people who criticize Israel who are anti-Semitic as well. But the majority of criticism of Israel is completely legitimate. We Israelis protest every week against our government and say things against our government, and I think it's certainly legitimate to say that not only in Israel but also abroad.
What kind of percentage do you think of Israelis are against it, though? Because we get a lot of mixed reports. We almost get the impression that the majority were in favour of this war.
Well, the majority were in favour of the war. There was a sense that revenge had to be taken, that Israel needed to reestablish its deterrence. It was very difficult after October 7th, when Israel failed to defend its border and an organization like Hamas was able to capture part of Israeli territory. It was very frightening. And of course, the 1,200 people who were killed on that one day, the biggest tragedy that happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. But what has been done by Israel since then does not legitimize in any way the need for Israel to defend itself. And this has to be clear. A majority of Israelis want this war to end. Between 60 to 80% on any day that a survey is done want the war to end, want the hostages to come home. And since October 7th, every single poll that's been done in Israel by legitimate pollsters show that the Netanyahu coalition could not win an election. They don't get more than 50 votes out of the 120 in the parliament, so they could not form a coalition. That doesn't mean we have a leader out there who's inspirational and calling us for peace, but it will happen.
And in terms of that moving towards the solid two-state solution, in terms of the popular support for that, where are we in Israel?
It's very difficult to talk about a two-state solution, to talk about peace while we're still at war and people are still traumatized. But I think that when Israelis come out of this war and Palestinians come out of this war and look at each other and know that we can't keep doing this, the two-state solution is the only viable option on the table. With all the difficulties of Israeli settlements and problems of Jerusalem and refugees, they can all be resolved. There are solutions for them. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and former Palestinian Foreign Minister Nasser Kidwa, myself and my Palestinian partner brought them together, and they together negotiated a plan, a kind of projection of what the future needs to look like. They're here in Paris now, and they've been going around the world and in Israel and in Palestine presenting their vision for peace, and it's real. People who say that living in peace is a fantasy are the ones who are wrong. Living without peace is the fantasy that we have to escape. We have to recognize that the time for peace is now.
But will that be an uphill battle? Is it still the minority?
It is an uphill battle. It will be an uphill battle. The biggest challenge is to convince Israelis and Palestinians that there are partners on the other side. And that's what we're trying to do here in Paris this Friday, is to demonstrate hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians who've flown to Paris to stand up together in public and say, we want peace. We support the two-state solution. We need more and more Israelis and Palestinians to be courageous and to stand up and say that. Because the majority of Israelis, the majority of Palestinians want peace. They just don't believe that there are partners on the other side.
Okay. Mr. Gershon Baskin, thanks so much for coming into studio and giving us your insight here on France 24. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.